Welcome. Will the hearing come to order, please? We're resuming our hearing that we began this morning. Glad to see you all. Most of you all actually came back. We were in the middle of the third panel, shipper panel. Mr. Slavin was about to speak when I hope kindly interrupted him, and so we could take a break for lunch. We'll try to be as civil about this process as we can be. So we'll resume with the third panel, shipper panel, this afternoon. Mr. Slavin, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Chairman Buttery, Vice Chairman Mulvey, thank you for this opportunity to speak on this issue. My name is Dan Slavin. I'm the Rail Services Manager for Granite Rock Company, and I'm going to speak a little bit on the effects of the fuel surcharge program that we're currently using on Granite Rock and the communities in which we operate. A little bit as background, Granite Rock is a 106-year-old family-owned construction materials and general engineering contractor. In 1992. We were the recipient of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. Granite Rock has been doing business with the railroad for its entire 106 years, as the very foundation of the company was first centered around supplying railroad ballast to the railroads for expansion. The company now supplies construction aggregates from Wilson Quarry near Watsonville, California, to rail serve locations from San Jose to San Francisco. Those are hauls from 40 to 90 miles. These branch locations rely solely on the Union Pacific for daily rail service, as congestion on highways and surrounding neighborhoods makes delivery of aggregates by truck impractical and undesired by local municipalities. In the peak construction season, our rail shipments run between 90 and 115 rail cars per day. This averages out to anywhere between 11,000 and 18,000 rail cars per year. The nation is again experiencing an unpredictable large increase in the cost of diesel fuel, as we all know. The increased diesel expense is a fact of life that all American businesses must deal with, and we believe that the use of a fair fuel surcharge program is an acceptable method for recovering the unpredictable fuel cost increases. A fair fuel surcharge program only recovers the additional fuel expense and nothing more. The current UP fuel surcharge is rate-based using the national HDL average. We're unhappy with this program as implemented because we believe it over-collects the actual fuel increase for our rail movements. Taking 2001 as a base year, our analysis of railroad data indicates that for the combined 2004-2005 period, Granite Rock overpaid the additional fuel expense by over $240,000. In other words, the fuel surcharge was about 26% greater than required to recover the additional expense. We believe that not all rail customers are paying the fuel surcharges. This practice, we believe, is a form of discriminatory pricing. A recent Wall Street Journal article reported, the article was in the April 18th edition of this year, that the UP says it spent $1.38 billion more on fuel last year than it collected in fuel surcharge revenue, partly because some long-term contracts lack surcharges. This is consistent with the fact that the surcharges exceed the increased fuel cost, but at the end of the year, UP's financial disclosures indicates that the amount collected is not sufficient to cover fuel costs. Therefore, clearly, not all customers are paying the charge. It appears that captive rail customers, like Granite Rock, are forced to pay an excessive fuel surcharge to compensate for larger, non-captive shippers that are unwilling to pay the additional surcharge or have contracts. We believe this is unfair and must be corrected. Excessive fuel charges coupled with higher than justifiable rate increases over the past 2 years are forcing freight back onto already congested highways and neighborhoods. This trend is not working in favor of American business and the American public. The railroads must treat all shippers fairly This includes captive shippers. A fuel surcharge must only collect the increased fuel expense for that shipper and nothing more. Captive shippers should not be expected to pay the fuel surcharges the railroad cannot collect from larger non-captive shippers. We seek the STB to intercede for all rail shippers to ensure that railroads design and implement fuel surcharge programs that fairly recover only additional fuel expense for their rail movements. Captive rail shippers should not be held hostage to pay the expenses incurred by larger non-captive shippers. Please note that Granite Rock is charging its customers a surcharge on diesel fuel, asphalt used in our hot mix, and other products that use petroleum products. However, these surcharges are sufficient to cover only our increased cost and are not used to supply another source of profit. Not only do we believe that this is fair, but in our competitive business, no other surcharge method has been acceptable to our customers. And just in summary, stressing some of the points other speakers have made this morning, surcharges must be cost-based, transparent, and subject to oversight. And thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Mr. Sharp.
Thank you, Chairman Buttry and Vice Chairman Mulvey, for the opportunity to address this issue before you today. I'm Steve Sharp with Arkansas Electric Cooperatives. We own parts of 3 coal-fired plants in Arkansas that all burn Powder River Basin coal. So obviously our interest is in shipment of coal out of the PRB. And I would invite you, Chairman Buttry, if you've never fished in Arkansas, we've got some wonderful fishing, especially trout fishing on the White River. It's really, if you've never done that, really, it's really
Actually,
great.
I have done that.
I see it.
You're successful.
I can tell you're a true fisherman if you've done that.
I spent 22 years in Memphis, so I was close by.
Oh, you were close by. Very good. From our standpoint, and I'm just going to go very quickly over some highlights. We have submitted testimony. With your permission, when I get done, I've got another piece that we'd like to submit to the board after today. That actually just got completed last night. I'll just go very quickly. From our standpoint, the fuel surcharge issue is a perfect example of what happens when you don't have an open, competitive market for freight transportation. That, to our way of thinking, that's a lot of why we got to this point. We've got no problem with the concept of recovering unforeseen fuel costs in the type of tariff environment that the railroads are pushing towards. But we're seeing this implemented on a unilateral basis without input from the customers. And like I said, we've already seen a couple of them change the system that they implemented not too long ago, which there again is another indication that this wasn't necessarily a well thought out and properly constructed system to begin with. And we do have concerns that in a lot of instances, the cost of these fuels and even indices are already being applied to the cost of these fuels that were meant, originally at least, meant to account for cost increases in the fuel, and that there may be some double dipping as some have caused it going on. But we've also got a concern that as the board looks at ways of improving this fuel surcharge situation, that we retain some element of encouraging increased efficiency and increased productivity with the railroads. We've got a little bit of concern if the railroads are totally divorced from the fuel cost and even the rate at which they're consuming fuel, that there would no longer be an incentive to push for higher efficiency locomotives and this sort of thing. And we'd like for that to be preserved in this process, if it's at all possible. Another issue that I hadn't heard mentioned a lot this morning and starting back this afternoon, The highway diesel fuel that both UP and BNSF use to index their fuel surcharges to is in our thinking not a perfect way of doing this, certainly, and others have spoken to some problems with it, but our attorneys discovered that this is going to get a little worse even as soon as this fall. The on-highway diesel fuel operators are going to be required this fall to comply with some new EPA requirements to phase in ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel for highway use. That is going to cause an increase in over-the-highway diesel costs. It's not going to have any effect on the diesel that the railroads purchase. So this is going to further disconnect that. The railroads do have to convert to this ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, but not until 2012. So there again, we would urge the board to consider some way of disconnecting this highway diesel fuel index from these fuel surcharges before it gets even further out of kilter. And the other category that I'd like to emphasize, which some people have mentioned, but to our way of thinking, the effect that these fuel surcharges will have on is having and will continue to have in the future on captive shippers is something that we're particularly sensitive to. One of our large coal burning plants is completely captive to the UP and therefore pays a higher rate to get that coal delivered to that plant. And as long as these fuel surcharges are being applied to the rate and not to something that better approximates what the actual fuel cost is, the captive shippers who are already paying higher rates because of their captivity and because of the situation that we find ourselves in with the railroads are just going to be hurt worse, because it's that multiplying, escalating effect that several people have already talked about. And so we would like to see a different mechanism that does not apply to the entire rate. In part, in response to the board's request for this hearing, we did undertake to make an example of a couple of our plant situations and come up with some specific numbers that we thought would represent the railroad's fuel cost, the increase in their fuel cost, and the increase in revenue that they're going to get under the surcharge amount. And that's the work I was referring to that was just finished last night, and we'll submit that with the board's approval. So you will have that, and everyone will have access to it. But to summarize it very briefly, and this is our Independence plant in Arkansas and our White Bluff plant in Arkansas. And this analysis was done by a consultant of ours, and we did not use any confidential data at all. This is all using public numbers, trying to come up with estimates for what the actual fuel cost was and what the surcharges would do. In the case of the Independence plant, the fuel surcharge mechanisms over-collect by $8,000 per train. Now, this plant takes approximately 375 trains a year. It's a little more than one a day. So that would result in an excess fuel revenue collection of $3 million a year just for that one plant, just for that one power plant in Arkansas. And we believe this is a very conservative estimate, and you can judge that for yourself when you see the numbers. The other plant that we did this study for, the White Bluff plant, does have some competitive, is in somewhat of a competitive rail situation with Burlington Northern and UP. The analysis of their different fuel surcharge mechanisms showed that as far as overcollection per train, they're overcollecting would overcollect almost the same amount under their different fuel surcharge mechanisms of about $4,000 per train. So that at that plant, using this conservative method, it's about $1.5 million per year of overcollection. So we will submit that, and there again, I appreciate the chance to present these comments and our written testimony, and be able to answer questions at the end of the panel.
Thank you, and those documents will be included in the record.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey. My name is Diane El Hakim, and I'm the Logistics Manager for Degussa Corporation based in Parsippany, New Jersey. And I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. This morning we heard individuals speak for many shippers, and associations represent entire industries. I am a shipper. I am a shipper. And one of Degussa's core businesses is chemicals. And not only am I a chemical shipper, I am a captive chemical shipper. And this morning we heard about the practice of the railroads in assessing fuel surcharges as a percentage of the rate. And historically, chemical rates, presently and historically, are assessed some of the highest rates in the rail industry. And the captivity factor adds to that. So I have submitted written testimony. In the interest of time, I just want to briefly touch on the focus of my testimony being that the unfairness and unreasonableness of the fuel surcharge being assessed as a percentage of the rate. Speaking to you as an individual shipper today, I would just like to make a case in point. Degussa Corporation has embarked on a major project which involves millions of dollars, the construction of a plant, the procurement of a rail fleet, which is no easy feat today given the long wait for cars. It was my task to procure a long-term rail contract for this move. And I had in my hand an offer for a 5-year contract with escalation factors based on indexes, RCAF, for 4 years after the initial term. After a short absence from the office, I came back to find my voicemail full of people on the project saying that the railroads had pulled back their offer. It was in the process of being executed, the contract. And when I inquired about it, it was true. The railroad had pulled back their offer and reclassified my product as a PIH, which is poison by inhalation. And instead of a 5-year contract, the new offer was a 6-month contract with a 220% increase on the original rate offered. And likewise, the fuel surcharge was increased by 220%. Now, the characteristics of moving this shipment had no bearing on the cost of fuel. It was still a 58,000-pound tank car hauling 180,000 pounds of a liquid commodity. And yet, due to this change, all things being equal in today's market, that would have added an additional $150,000 per year over and above the original fuel surcharge. Now, is this fair? Absolutely not. The other situation I would like to talk about is that I can ask for a rate today, and I will be given, say, a rate of $3,000 per car plus fuel surcharge. But the fuel surcharge is based on a 2002 index, and I have to think, and I do believe, that in the railroad's initial rate offer to me, that they take into consideration their current costs. They might be lagging behind a little bit, but I sincerely doubt that it's 4 years, and if that's the case, thank God Degussa isn't behind 4 years on my paycheck. One of the key benchmarks used today is the revenue to variable cost analysis. And the STB places the threshold for rate reasonableness at 180% over the railroad's variable cost. Due to the great fluctuation in this variable cost as it is today, I'm wondering if the fuel surcharge is flying under the radar. It was mentioned before, is the fuel surcharge a rate or a practice? And it could be argued both ways in several different ways depending on the situation and the interpretation. For example, if a fuel surcharge can be negotiated, to me that's a rate. If a fuel surcharge is applied based on a given scale across all commodities, that's a practice. And again, it could be argued by different people different ways depending on the situation and the interpretation. In speaking to you as an individual shipper today, I am not here seeking restitution. I say let the past stay in the past. The railroads for years have been deemed revenue inadequate. And with the prosperous economy over the last 2 years and the record volumes that the railroads are handling, capacity issues, dwell times have been a problem for shippers as well as railroads. With the increased revenues that the railroads have been receiving over the last 2 years, I think that this is a good thing, regardless of how they got it, because they've announced collectively $8 billion in infrastructure improvements, which include double and triple tracking main corridors, expanding yards, adding locomotives, hiring trainmen and crews. In today's economy, with the congestion, both in the intermodal business and carload business, because even though they're two modes, they share the same tracks, I think this is a good thing, and it benefits the shippers in the long run. However, moving forward, I think there must be a change in the way the railroads are calculating their fuel surcharges. Fuel surcharges are rampant. The fuel costs themselves are extremely high, and I don't think they're going any higher. All the reports I've seen, they're not going any lower, rather. So I hereby request that the Surface Transportation Board investigate the method and calculation by which the railroads are applying fuel surcharges. I personally commend those railroads who are attempting, and I say attempting, to implement a mileage-based fuel surcharge based on a fair scale. It's a first step towards a change that is long overdue, and I also want to commend the Surface Transportation Board for allowing this hearing to bring this issue forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conway.
Thank you, Chairman Buttrey, and to Vice Chairman Mulvey. My name is James Conway. I am Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Griffin Industries of Cold Spring, Kentucky. Griffin Industries and this speaker would like to thank the board for holding what we consider to be very important hearings on a very important topic, and we'd also like to thank you for the opportunity to address the board this afternoon in this session. Griffin Industries is a 63-year-old family-owned company with 23 plants located in the southeast United States. By today's standards, at least at this meeting, we would be considered a small company. But this subject is important to our owners and to our 1,500 employees. We process agricultural waste products into usable commodities such as fats, oils, and dry feed ingredients. Until recently, we operated a fleet of over 500 tank, box, and hopper-bottom cars to assist us in the delivery of our finished products. Recently, we've had to decrease the size of our fleet by over 10% because of increasing cost of delivery by rail providers. It has, in fact, caused us to change to people to whom we do business with, and in some cases have even had to lose customers of long-standing nature. Now, we had earlier submitted our written testimony, and it is not my intent today to repeat the entirety of that document. But I would like to address what I think are some important issues that are really pertinent to the fuel surcharge. As energy costs continue to change the landscape of American business, one area that has been especially hard hit by those higher energy costs is agribusiness. Basic commodities, which represent the vast majority of agribusiness, are traditionally very inelastic to price changes. Many times, increased costs are absorbed by the producer rather than being passed through that maybe many other manufactured products can do. In fact, we sell on a delivered basis, and we get all we can get, but we then absorb all increased costs. Now, our company has had a long-standing partnership with many of the Class I railroads in this country. We rely on their service, and certainly we respect their right to earn a fair and reasonable profit for the service they provide. But we are also aware that they operate in a somewhat different competitive environment than many companies do. As a customer, Griffin does not have the ability to change rail suppliers at its individual plant locations. We are locked in to the road that services that particular area. And under that circumstance, it is imperative that regulations exist for the fair treatment of unusual cost events. Now, with particular reference to the current practice of adding fuel surcharges to the base rates, I have 4 specific concerns that I'd like to express to the board, and I'd like to take just a few moments to expand on each of them. First of all, we have been subjected to significant base rate increases over each of the past few years. In fact, in the written testimony I submitted earlier, I cited that our average base rate went up 17.5% in 2005 versus 2004. And these were on the heels of substantial increases in base rates both in 04 and 03. Now, in all cases, these rate increases utilize the RCAF to calculate what those should be. And as has been clearly demonstrated and testified earlier today, in our opinion, RCAF does in fact include the increased cost of fuel as part of its adjustment factor. In very simple terms, the increased fuel costs have already been factored into the base rates before any surcharge is added. Number 2, we do object to the fact that the fuel surcharge is calculated on the total of the base rate. In other words, the surcharge is calculated on that portion of the base rate that is designed to cover such things as labor, depreciation, and other cost factors. All of this, even though the percent of the surcharge is calculated on the actual increase in fuel. If one accepts the need for a fuel surcharge, it should not be applied to the entirety of the base rate. Number 3, the surcharges that are used today are based on the price of number 2 diesel fuel that was established in the 1990s and on the arbitrary rate of $23 per barrel of crude oil. I would think that none of us would say that either of these two barometers are really relevant in today's economics. They are history. This is especially true in consideration of the earlier contention that these increases had already been factored into the base rates. The railroad's contention that surcharges were only meant to be applicable for those temporary times that fuel costs are excessive is no longer applicable in today's real-world economics. Higher fuel costs are a fact of life and have already been factored into most base rates, as I can determine, and should no longer be a vehicle for revenue enhancement. In view of these objections, if one is to accept the need for some type of increased fuel cost adjustment, and as I said earlier, we accept that fact, it should only be applied to the increases in true fuel cost since the last contract or the last tariff rate has been established. This would allow for true fuel cost increases relative to a specific rate. And we implore the board to consider this as a specific recommendation in the future handling of fuel surcharges after recent or most recent base rate changes have occurred. Mr. Chairman, I would again like to thank the board for giving Griffin Industries the opportunity to present our side of this important issue. Please understand that we do not seek special treatment, nor do we expect the nation's railroads to subsidize our business. We do ask that increased fuel costs be handled in a fair and reasonable manner, that if surcharges are truly needed, that they be transparent, open, and market-driven, maybe you've heard that before today, and not used to exploit a captive customer's base that rely on the service and the function of these companies. We look forward to a fair and reasonable action by this board in this important issue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, I wish I could sit here and say, well, I agree with all my colleagues to the right, but I'll go through my process. I'm from Idaho, and I'm glad there's other people from Idaho, Montana, and Eastern Washington. Hopefully there's nothing wrong with the water out there, so we're just trying to get through a lot of processes. I'm Dave Weissel. I'm Director of Distribution for Potlatch Forest Products. Give you a little bit of history. Potlatch celebrated their 100 years in 2003, and we're a forest products, lumber, particle board, paper, consumer products company, and we got plants obviously around the trees, the 1.5 million acre trees in Arkansas, Idaho, and Minnesota. We have fuel surcharges in barges, motor carriers, ocean carriers that we use, as well as rail. So it's not that we're against fuel surcharges. We have them, and we understand that the carriers have to get their compensation for out-of-pocket cost, but doing it on applying the surcharges on the freight rate rather than seeking payment of the increase in the price paid for the consumed fuel, we believe is overcompensating and an unreasonable practice. And Potlatch is convinced that the surcharges that they have no more than reimburse the railroads for higher fuel costs they are incurring, and they are not in fact establishing a profit center. And we have seen nothing from the railroads as data to provide us that says, to show us that the fuel surcharges are reasonable, or explains why they should be such a wide disparity in the surcharges they are assessing, particularly when they are pegged, a lot of them are pegged on the West Texas Intermediate crude. And you have a lot of formulas, but recognize that the Surface Transportation Board is going to have a very difficult job in coming up with a reasonable, transparent, and type of program that we can all sit down and figure out. But however, I would say I've got a pretty difficult job, or these companies do, of explaining this to our senior management. I mean, to give you a perfect example of something that transpired not too long ago, they said, well, Dave, what are some of these guys pegging it on? And I said, well, West Texas Intermediate crude. Well, some of them who even alluded that today, it's such volatility that you can't budget for it. It does nothing to explain what's consumed. It does nothing to explain what's reasonable. It does nothing to explain where you're going in the future. So I do say the BNSF and their mileage program was a good attempt to get it on something that we all recognize. As somebody explained here this morning, you can recognize a car going 1,000 miles is going to consume more than a car going 500 miles. So you can explain that, but explaining some of this is pretty difficult. If you take the motor carrier as an example, and I understand that's not rail, but if you take a motor carrier and you take the current fuel price and the base fuel price and you divide the result by the average miles per gallon efficiency for a truck, this results in a close approximation of the additional expense the truck transportation actually incurs due to the increased fuel cost. For example, you can relate to 5-6 miles per gallon increase in fuel costs for a truck that averages 6 miles per gallon results in 1 cent per mile surcharge. You can relate to that. And this is the reason we're looking at a cost-based fuel program that can be applied to all railroads. That way we know what we're paying for, we know it's reasonable, and we can track back pending the indexes and the data is relevant that where we're going. I did give you a handout, and I'll just take a short moment of explaining what that is. We are not presently on the BNSF mileage program, so that's the first thing I got to explain. But if you took these movements, Prescott to Dallas, the current rail program under the current fuel surcharges at 223 miles, we'd be paying $347 in fuel surcharge. And you can equate that to 1,000 board feet per car and 1,000 board feet per car fuel surcharge. If you take a longer miles Lewiston to Chicago of 1,743 miles, you're presently paying $602 or $622. If you took the BNSF mileage program for the same 1,743 miles, you're paying $575 fuel surcharge. If you take the bottom one, next to the bottom one, Gwinn, Michigan to Mobile, Alabama of 1,220 miles, you're paying $394 under the present program. Under the BNSF program, you're paying $403 fuel surcharge. Under a Rule 11, Lewiston to Kingston, Pennsylvania, for a 2,413 mile movement, you're paying $1,093. And if you break that out, portion-wise, BNSF portion, Lewiston to Chicago, 1,743 miles, you're paying $622. And the NS portion for lesser miles from Chicago to beyond of 670 miles, you're paying $471. The total BNSF mileage program for 2,413 miles is $796. And if you take what even the railroads are looking at this thing as mileage, and I know it's in the Wall Street Journal article, but if you allow me to read this, it was in the May 8th Wall Street Journal, and it says, at last there's a way to get 410 miles per gallon. And at Norfolk Southern, we're conscientious at the pump. We're always working to increase capacity while using less fuel. From improved infrastructure and shorter miles to onboard computers, we are able to accomplish an efficiency unimaginable just a few years ago. Today we can move a ton of freight, an average of 410 miles on just 1 gallon of diesel fuel, mileage that keeps America economy strong. And I would have to say that, we just have to take a reasonable and transparent and willing to work with the board on anything that we need to work on to be able to explain ourselves at the end of the day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman.
Thanks to all of you for your testimony. The carriers are required under SEC rules to file a great deal of data concerning the internal workings of the company, individual companies. And there's been a lot made here about the issue of transparency. What is it that you would expect to get on this transparency issue from the carriers that's not already available in their SEC filings? That they would be able to let out into the public domain, so to speak, without being too proprietary, if you will.
Well, I think there are elements of fuel or data of fuel that they submit already to the STB. And so I guess what we'd like to see is we can equate miles to miles. But there, and you could even do test programs of figuring out, okay, are we compensating? Sort of like we do in truck. The motor carriers come back to us and say, we got to adjust the miles per gallon because we're not getting that, and they can prove that to us on the trucks themselves. We give them that additional increase. So it's a data exchange of reasonableness, and you can equate it back to something that you can take to your upper management and say, well, I'm changing from 6 miles per gallon to 5.5 miles per gallon because they proved to me that's what they're getting. So I guess I would say I'm not smart enough to know what that is out there, but there must be data out there because this article, obviously, I don't know where that's marketing, I grant it, but there must be data available to know what you can move a ton of freight, a mile.
Anyone else?
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I think there's one more member of this panel that hasn't spoken yet.
Total Petrochemical, sir.
We can come up after these people are
are finished if you like, or we can do it now, whatever you like, Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, you weren't sitting up at the table there, and I'm sorry, we probably need to get your testimony in the record right away here before we proceed further with questions. I apologize for overlooking that. I'm sorry.
Well, there's a lot of interest in this topic, for sure.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairman Buttry and Vice Chairman Mulvey. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. My name is Steve Posick, and I'm Vice President of Supply Chain for Total Petrochemicals USA, Inc., or as we refer to it, TPI. With me is our counsel, Michael McBride, who will address legal issues with respect to your authority over fuel surcharges. I should start by saying that TPI is owned by the fourth largest oil company in the world, Total S.A. TPI is a part of the petrochemicals branch of Total S.A., and we manufacture and sell petrochemicals and plastics. Our concern with this important issue is primarily related to the 4 to 5 billion pounds of plastic pellets we produce each year and our reliance on the railroads to transport our product throughout North America. Now, although TPI is owned by an oil company, the petrochemicals branch is operated independently and is expected to stand on its own as a profitable financial venture. It is not the intention of Total S.A. to subsidize its different divisions, and in fact, being focused on financial performance, Total S.A. is not required to own a petrochemical business in order to be profitable. One can validate this by looking at some competing oil companies who have chosen to spin off their petrochemical divisions. Two examples include BP, which spun off its petrochemical business into what is now known as INEOS, and Shell, which spun off part of its petrochemical business into Brazil. Understanding that perspective, I hope you understand that as a major consumer of energy, energy which is not subsidized, we at TPI do understand what rising fuel costs mean to the bottom line. Fuel is as much a cost to TPI as it is to the railroads. I wish I could say that the plastics industry has the market power that the railroads have. If we did, then perhaps we could pass on to our customers the rising cost of fuel in the form of a fuel surcharge. We're making a commodity, plastic pellets. Being in an intensely competitive business and fully subject to the antitrust laws of the United States, my industry has to fight rising fuel costs not with unilaterally imposed fuel surcharges, but with improvements in efficiency. Having said that, we can understand the basis for a fuel surcharge. And since it is being imposed unilaterally and with discipline by the railroads, we have to accept the reality of fuel surcharges. What we don't understand is the logic that is applied to the calculation method and the lack of transparency and therefore understanding as to whether or not these fuel surcharges are simply covering increases in actual fuel costs or whether the fuel surcharges are padding the pockets of the railroads with additional profits. For us at TPI, the issue at hand is simple. We ship more than 20,000 hopper cars a year by rail. The rail mode is essential to us. At origin, 1/3 of our business is captive to a single railroad, and at destination, more than half are captive to a single railroad. And I point this out because current fuel surcharges, as we've heard all morning, are based on percentage of the rate that we pay. And we all know that captive shippers pay anywhere from 2 to 4 times what shippers who have choice pay. So calculating the fuel surcharge as a function of the base rate means that for equivalent routes, our captive ones pay 2 to 4 times as much as those routes that are competitively served. This pricing methodology is illogical and unfair. The rates we pay in our current agreements have embedded in them the cost of fuel at some price. We know that is true, or railroads would have been charging fuel surcharges from the beginning. Instead, they began to impose surcharges as fuel prices began to rapidly increase over the last few years. Our question is this: are railroad fuel surcharges designed to recover the cost increase relative to the base price or the entire cost of fuel? We are quite confident, based on Wall Street reports, that some double dipping is occurring. We are unsure of the extent to which this may be occurring specific to TPI due to the lack of transparency in reporting from the railroads. It's unclear as to how the fuel surcharges collected relate to the fuel that is consumed on our routes. By definition, though, if a fuel surcharge is a function of the rate, and TPI's rates have less to do with mileage and more to do with whether routes are closed to a single railroad or competitively served, we can be certain that TPI is paying more than its share for the cost of fuel. Only if a fuel surcharge is based on mileage or other proxy for actual fuel costs incurred could the methodology be fair. As a shipper, what do I think is fair? We expect any fuel surcharge to be based on fuel consumption. More specifically, a fuel surcharge should be based on the actual fuel that is consumed for the ton miles related to our traffic. That means it should not be based on West Texas Intermediate or even highway diesel costs. Moreover, we expect it to be based on unexpected price increases relative to the base price of fuel that's in the current rate structure. If the price of fuel decreases below the base, and we're using a fuel surcharge methodology, we should get a credit. In summary, we expect the fuel surcharges to be revenue neutral, to be based on fuel consumption for our specific routes, and we expect open and transparent reporting of the accounting related to fuel surcharges. Thank you very much for this opportunity to appear before you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, members of the staff, I am Michael McBride. Let me begin, and if I don't conclude within the time allotted on this panel, I am on the next panel, and I'll complete the legal argument on the next panel. In any event, I want to begin by saying that the question is not whether the railroads are fully recovering their costs through their fuel surcharges. That seemingly has been the question that some people have posed today. The question ought to be whether the railroads are recovering all of their fuel costs. Total is in favor of the railroads being able to recover all of their costs. But they do recover fuel costs already in their base rates, as Mr. Puxick has just indicated, and through RCAF or other indexed adjustments. So the question ought to be whether, in addition thereto, whether they are over-recovering for their fuel costs by imposing fuel surcharges as well. Now, this is not just a semantic dispute, because it goes to the heart of your authority. It is not as if the railroads say these are rates and the shippers say these are practices. And what's a feller to do? Rather, the fact is that the railroads say that they charge rates, and the railroads then say, and we charge fuel surcharges. They, in fact, charge fuel surcharges sometimes in separate invoices, or at least as a separate line item on the same invoice. Therefore, this is an admission against interest that a fuel surcharge is not a rate. And as Mr. Loftus already indicated, by admission through filings with this board, Norfolk Southern has called surcharges rules or practices. Therefore, by definition, the limitations on your authority over rates do not apply to separate charges that they call something other than a rate. That disposes of the Union Pacific versus ICC case cited in your notice. I should know, I argued that case on the side of the board. That case was a challenge to rates. We alleged market dominance. The ICC did not make a finding of market dominance, and all the court held was the ICC had to find market dominance when rates were being challenged. That is the extent of the holding in that case, and it has nothing, therefore, to do with fuel surcharges. We did not understand that the board wanted to adjudicate now whether the exact level of any surcharge was unreasonable. And Vice Chairman Mulvey, I do concede the question is whether it is reasonable or unreasonable. But we have proffered some evidence. Some is attached to the Edison Electric Institute filing you'll be hearing about on the next panel. Others have pointed to a variety of Wall Street reports. There is plenty of evidence that the railroads are over-recovering for their fuel costs. I will be happy to provide additional Wall Street reports if you want them and need them. But I would also want to observe that the Norfolk Southern advertisement that the gentleman just read to you from this Monday's Wall Street Journal demonstrates that by the railroad's admission, they are achieving great gains in railroad fuel efficiency. And those are not reflected in any fuel surcharge mechanism that the railroads are imposing. Not one, despite the differences in the railroads' fuel surcharge mechanisms. There is a simple solution if we're all grasping for how to solve the problem. The board publishes the rail cost adjustment factor with productivity. That registers efficiency gains. As Mr. Crowley indicated, it's based on forecast prices. It's not a lagged index, it's a forecast index. If we want to return to first principles, you ought to say it is presumptively reasonable to use the RCAF to adjust rates. Everything else may be subject to a complaint filed with the board. Thank you.
Did that get everybody on this panel?
Yes, sir.
I don't want to make the same mistake in the same hearing. You what?
I have one more testimony.
Yeah. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask the panel? Yeah. Go ahead.
Mr. McBride, I'll start with you, I guess. One of the things we've heard that if indeed the fuel surcharge is a practice and it's deceptive because it's not really tied to the price of fuel, couldn't the railroads just turn around and say, okay, it's a practice, we're going to call it now a rate, we're going to increase the rates by X amount, and that's the end of it?
Well, there's been an announcement by one railroad that that's in fact what it's going to do. As somebody suggested earlier, that may be a function of the fact that you held this hearing. And the shippers will have to deal with that if in fact that's what happens on July 1. That's Norfolk Southern, as I think you know. But I would observe to you that your concern about the railroads raising adequate revenues to pay for the infrastructure that they need, which you and I have discussed more than once, and which concern you and I share, is not in any way adversely affected by any action you might take on fuel surcharges. Because since 1980, there has been precious little limitation on railroad rate increases, as we all know. And if the railroads want to take rate increases and then face the possibility of a complaint or contractual action if there's a contractual limitation on the rate, then so be it. But at least things would then be transparent and out in the open as to what they're doing. But there is no limitation on a railroad's ability to raise revenue here. What the shippers are objecting to is that they have a rate, whether it's agreed upon or otherwise, and then the railroad says, oh, and we're not recovering all of our fuel, and so we're going to surcharge for it separately. And the shipper says, well, show me you're not recovering for all your fuel costs, and the railroad says no. And you've heard that over and over again. And that's the problem, and there is only one entity in America that can do anything about it, and that's you.
And we need the data to do that.
Absolutely. You can't regulate intelligently without the data.
Doug, of course, I'll come back.
The article that I read about Norfolk Southern was a little confusing to me about how this rate would kick in. On first blush, anyway, it would appear that there would be an inclusion of part of the rate of fuel cost increase in the rate, but there would at some point a new fuel surcharge would then kick in at a much lower point. So it's a little bit of both. It's not just one or the other.
Well, that is true, but there's some curious things about it, too, and we might hear more from them later, because I obviously don't speak for them, and I don't know with certainty how they're going to do it either. Mm-hmm. But the clients are confused, I can tell you that. But here's what we seem to know. Norfolk Southern has said, look, the current surcharge was based on some much lower number, $23, $25, $28 a barrel, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. Fuel prices have now risen to a much higher level, as we all know. Therefore, they say, we're going to reset the rates at the $64 per barrel price. But the curious thing was that when they said that, crude oil prices were much higher than $64 a barrel. So where did $64 come from? One of my clients suggested that it must have been the number they had in their budget. But there's no relationship to any actual cost of fuel at the time they did that. And they've not provided any forecast that oil prices are going to be at $64 on July 1. So we start from a number that seems arbitrary. And then secondly, they say they're going to raise rates. But the concern that a lot of people have is, does that mean then that becomes a floor? So that the concerns you've heard today about if fuel should go back down to, say, $40 or $50 a barrel, there won't be any corresponding reduction, means that it becomes a one-way mechanism again. And this agency and its predecessor have had experience with that. When the RCAF started to go down in the mid-'80s, the agency ruled that rates should go down accordingly, that adjustment mechanisms should be used to recover costs and not become profit centers. And so we have some concerns about how the NS rate mechanism is going to work. But we have at least this much assurance, Mr. Chairman, that there may be some people who get an improved outcome from it, because Norfolk Southern has been trying to surcharge on top of contractual rates that have adjustments for the RCAF in them. If they're going to at least try to raise rates that they have a right to raise, let's assume, at least they won't be trying to surcharge, one hopes, rates that are already being adjusted for fuel. So it may be something of a mixed bag, I'll concede, but we have some very great concerns about it. And I think the arbitrariness of using something other than off-highway diesel, using West Texas Intermediate or on-highway diesel, which they don't burn, instead of off-highway diesel, which they do burn, and then picking some arbitrary number like $64 a barrel and using that as a floor, perhaps, all lead to a lot of concerns in the shipping community that this whole fuel surcharge program is becoming a profit center. And that we object to.
The NS change may be similar to the BNSF change for the grain shippers and falls under the category, be careful what you wish for. You may just get it. With regard to total, you were talking about the fact that between competitive and non-competitive chemical traffic, obviously the rates are different, and therefore the fuel surcharges are different. Do you have any specific examples you could provide the board as to whereas the movement and the weights, et cetera, are roughly the same, and yet the fuel surcharge varies a lot because of the differences in the rates?
Yes, and in fact, we included that in our written testimony, and if you would like more examples, we can provide more. We'd be pleased to do that.
Thank you.
I handed up several copies of the written testimony.
Okay.
You think the written version of the oral? We submitted separate written testimony.
Thank you.
We have that. It'll be put in the record.
Thank
Anything
you.
else? Yes, ma'am. Okay, go ahead.
Would you like more examples? Would you
No,
like?
I haven't looked at this one yet. I was looking at Mr. McBride's testimony, so we did read most of this, but it was a lot to read, I'll tell you. Let me see. Mr. Heller, on the when you were calculating the fuel surcharges, how did you calculate them, the gross fuel surcharges? Were you doing that revenue calculation for the gross fuel surcharges? There were some criticisms of the way they were done by a consultant for, I think, Escalation Incorporated, the sense that they were multiplying the fuel surcharges across all the traffic, and not just for the traffic that it pays them. Would you do the same thing, or were you more traffic specific in your estimates?
I was very traffic specific. The way I did this was to do an individual move and do the calculation relative to an individual move. So I wasn't trying to presume that the railroads were in fact applying the surcharges across all of their traffic. The purpose of this was to illustrate, as I understood the question to be, for an individual shipment, what would the effect of the revenue under the fuel surcharges be.
Okay. Granite Rock? Yes. You said that you're a captive shipper. You say that the pricing is discriminatory pricing, but the railroads are allowed to engage in price discrimination or Ramsey pricing. Isn't that not so? So why shouldn't they be allowed to differentially price the fuel surcharge if they can differentially price the traffic in general?
Well, basically, we feel that's basically just unfair, whether they are allowed to do so or not. It's it ought to be fair. It ought to be out in the open. And
would you say it's because it's not a rate? Is it because it's a practice, not a price, not a rate?
We believe it's a practice.
Okay. I have a question about from the Arkansas Electric Company. What percent? I'm sorry. We need to get a bigger table. When our new quarters, we're going to have a table that will seat 400. So.
Go ahead.
What percent of the fuel surcharge increase? How much of that does that? How much does that affect your rates to your final customers? The fuel surcharge, as you say, costs you several millions of dollars, but in terms of the impact on the rate to the final electric consumers, how much is that? Could you?
Any increase we have in our fuel cost as a electric utility that's regulated in the state of Arkansas, that additional cost is passed on to our members.
Mm-hmm.
So they pay every penny of it.
But how much is that to the final consumer? I mean, sometimes this comes down to pennies a month for individual consumers.
As a percentage,
yeah.
I can get that. I didn't calculate it as a percentage. But.
Okay. You noted that the fuel surcharge rate on coal is about 5% higher than on carload traffic. But wouldn't that be due to the fact that coal would be heavier and therefore, because of that, it might be more fuel intensive than carload traffic?
Well, there are quite a few differences between the way, as I understand it. Like I said, we don't ship any carload grain traffic, but we are involved in a lot of coal, and there are a lot of differences there. Again, we in the shipment of this coal, these are all unit trains that are kept whole as a unit, typically 135 cars for our use, because all of our coal comes from the Powder River Basin, comes to these power plants in Arkansas, and the empty cars go straight back. So it's you don't get this adding cars on, taking cars off, and so forth. That unit train stays intact from Wyoming to Arkansas and back. And from Wyoming to Arkansas, the loaded trains are coming that direction. The elevations up in Wyoming are about 5,000 feet. In Arkansas, it's about 300 feet. So you're going downhill. You're going downhill with the loads, and you're going uphill with the empties, always, every trip. And that saves fuel. I mean, there's a big difference between just coasting a train downhill. Now, obviously, there are areas where they got to go uphill and downhill, but the overall difference is downhill. So it's going to take less energy. Where a lot of your grain movements are east-west in nature, and you don't see such a big difference in the elevations.
That might explain some of the reason for the rate differences.
It could.
Vice Chairman Mulvey,
yes.
if I may, I'm on this panel. I just lost
right.
my seat.
We apologize for that.
If the thrust of your question...
Speak to the microphone.
Okay. If the thrust of your question, Vice Chairman Mulvey, isn't there reason to believe that, notwithstanding the differences, the fuel surcharge on the coal traffic may be reasonably related to the incremental fuel cost? The answer is clearly no. And that's been demonstrated in Mr. Heller's testimony and the testimony of others. And in fact, although I haven't seen all the railroad statements, I'm not aware of any railroad suggesting that the fuel surcharge revenues are reasonably related to their increased costs for fuel on a movement-by-movement basis. So, and while I'm here, you should disallow something that is claimed to be a fuel cost surcharge if it's not. And the fact that, as you've pointed out, in this environment, the railroads have the pricing power to turn around and increase the rates anyway, maybe so. But then you know what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a profit margin increase as such, and not under the pretext of a fuel cost recovery mechanism.
Do you want, as long as you're up there, do you want to say a few words also about the issue of whether or not this is a rate increase as opposed to a non-rate factor, a practice or a rule rather than a price?
I would. We clearly believe that the fuel surcharge mechanisms are not rates, as that term is used in the statute, and that they are a practice. As we noted when we spoke earlier, at least one railroad has so acknowledged in writing before this board. So we don't believe that this falls under your maximum rate jurisdiction. It falls rather under your jurisdiction over unreasonable rules or practices, which you have the authority to set aside.
Both the chairman and I have both expressed some concern about the what's out there in terms of precedent. Now, I know that you've cited a number of cases, et cetera, but are there any specific court or board or ICC cases you could point us to that might be illustrative for us?
We would agree with you that authority is sparse in the area. We have, in our written comments, in the argument section, provided the authorities we thought were relevant, and I can't say that I can, without getting it out and reading you some of it, do much better than what we've done in writing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
A question for DeGrussa. Are you limited in your ability to pass on these prices? Is the demand for your product relatively elastic with regard to competitors or
We are
products?
limited depending on the product line and the market. We are very limited in what we can pass along.
Is there any threat to your survival as a business? Or
To some business units, but I don't want to blame that solely on the fuel surcharge. There are so many other factors affecting the business, not just the rail industry.
Mm-hmm.
But again, to some smaller businesses, I do see a threat, not just for survival of the entire business, but it's forcing us to selectively decide who we're going to supply. So based on costs and market and availability. In some instances, some of our products, we just can't produce them at any sort of, make any sort of a profit on them.
okay, thank you.
And I'd like to address one of the questions you had posed before about providing examples of different commodities. In my written testimony, I've given exhibits from 3 railroads, so that, and I do have other copies if you'd like them.
Thank you.
I don't think we have anything further for this panel, so you're excused, and we will take up the next panel.
Well, fun going back to Cincinnati. Thank you. It's like I'll make my flight on
The next panel for this afternoon is the panel of trade associations. We're expecting testimony from the National Industrial Transportation League, the American Chemistry Council, and from Edison Electric Institute. Are there any other people in this panel that wish to testify?
John wants to go first? Sure.
Anybody else want to be on this panel?
Mr. McBride, are you coming back with the railroads also? Or
If you'll permit me to, sure. Mine's over there. No, he's not here now. Mr. Linderman's not here.
This may be a dangerous precedent, letting Mr. McBride speak twice on 2 different panels. I'm not sure about that. We'll have to consult our counsel and see. Someone suggested you might be double dipping, Mr. And I would advise you that doesn't sound like something good to me. I don't know.
No. I stipulate to that.
Unless you're talking about M&Ms or something like that. I'd make an exception for them.
Are we ready for some football?
Mr. Picker, are you ready to go?
Mr. Chairman, I have been ready to go from 9 o'clock this morning.
I saw you back there bright and early. I thought that might be the
we
case.
had a break for that.
Did you?
We welcome this panel this afternoon. It looks like everybody in the audience is eager to hear what you have to say, and so we'd like to have you proceed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vice Chairman, pleasure to be here as always. The board is a great place to share ideas about the important world of transportation. You know us and we know you. We've been with you before on this very subject, and we'll talk about that a little briefly. We've put in our written comments, and today we'd like to expand on those comments slightly. We have a PowerPoint presentation to do that. And to begin our presentation, I'd like to introduce our first vice chairman of the league, who will be my boss next year, Kurt Warfel from Eka Chemicals of Atlanta, Georgia. Kurt?
Thank you, John. Chairman Buttrey, Vice Chairman Mulvey. The NIT League has a number of key positions relative to fuel surcharges. First off, we agree that a fuel surcharge, properly structured and properly administered, is an appropriate method for recovering extraordinary, and I'll say that again, extraordinary increases in fuel costs. We believe that fuel surcharges, which are based on freight costs, it says freight cost here, but really what we're saying is the amount of freight that's being paid creates significant inequities. We believe that it's improper to rob from Peter to pay Paul. And we firmly believe that the STB does have the authority to oversee fuel surcharge programs. Now, John's going to address each of these in a little more detail later on. Now, while we do believe it is proper to use fuel surcharges to recover increased fuel costs, we ought to point out that there are at least two other means by which a carrier can recover fuel costs. Several carriers today have mentioned RCAF, or speakers have mentioned RCAF. Perhaps more logically, a carrier could enter into shorter-term contracts that enable them to recover the cost of fuel a little more quickly. Now, the league thinks that a snapshot of a proper fuel surcharge program would contain these following elements. It'd be related to the actual changes in fuel cost incurred to transport a shipper's goods. It would not be revenue generating. It would recognize the differences in fuel costs for different types of rail services, say, for example, from unit train coal to merchandise traffic. It would use an index that accurately reflects a carrier's fuel cost, and perhaps most importantly, it would reflect the true base fuel cost used to establish a freight rate. Now, on the other hand, what would an unreasonable fuel surcharge program look like? Well, it'd be one that would charge some customers an excessive fuel surcharge to make up for not charging other customers a fuel surcharge, period. It'd be based on a percentage of the freight rate, which, as several speakers have already said today, tends to create a significant inequity when looking at different commodity groups. It would use an index that tends to overcompensate the carrier for fuel cost changes, and it would apply the same fuel surcharge rate on price quotes, even those issued today, that presumably would already have the higher cost of fuel built in. Well, John's going to talk a little bit about some of the
You all know that we have been with you on this subject for almost 2 years now. We've come to the board in 2004, met with the former chairman and talked to him along with National Grain and Feed and several other associations. We produced a study and we produced a series of recommendations. We determined that the best approach was a private sector approach, and we agreed to meet with key rail officials, which we did, and then we met with the board after that to advise the board on the effect of those particular meetings. When we met with rail carriers, we presented to each rail carrier our study and our proposal. We have a proposal, and we'll again share that with you today, which we believe is a fair, equitable, and transparent proposal. We would like to commend the BNSF, CN, and CP for listening to the arguments that we made and the discussions we had about the unfairness of the current structure and taking some actions to address those things. We believe the actions were well intended and are moving in the right direction. We would probably like to see more. We're disappointed, however, that the eastern carriers have chosen not to pay any attention to that. Here is an example of some of the data that has been talked about today that shows over-recovery. The green bar recognizes the increased fuel expense per car